Hello everyone, and welcome to this introductory video on early corner permutation. This is a technique for improving ergonomics and TPS when solving a 3x3 with one hand. In this video I will talk about what the technique is, how it can be used in many different methods, and why I believe it's worth learning and implementing in your OH solves. So to begin with, let's look at OH turning. The fastest and easiest is our U-turn, which can be done with no rotation. In other words, a state like this that is reduced to an RU moveset can be solved very quickly, but the likelihood of actually receiving this in a competition is very, very slim. So let us then look at how we can reduce a generic scrambled state into a state like this. So to begin with, you have the solid piece of the 2x2x3 block. We have the other pieces which can be scrambled but perhaps belong to some form of orbit. And the parts of this is edge orientation and permutation, and corner orientation and permutation. So we can see here that edge orientation needs to be solved. We cannot flip an edge with only RU turns. But let's take a scrambled cube, only use RU moves, and see what kind of states we can reach. We can do a U-perm with only RU moves. In other words, because we cannot swap only two edges, we can actually reach all edge permutation states with RU moves, and we do not need to care about it in order to reduce the cube into a state solvable by RU moves. We can also twist two corners. We cannot twist only one corner, so we do not need to care about corner orientation either when performing this reduction. But after all these moves, we can see here that the corners are actually still permuted correctly. And essentially, we cannot do something like a T-perm without a need for a third layer to be used. But identifying what corners need to be swapped is a bit tough. It takes a couple seconds. But it is doable. We just need to do it in inspection. So how can we find a state here? This reduction is a bit tough. How can we find an intermediate state in which we are able to preserve corner permutation, but that is easier to reach from a generic scrambled one? And we see here that slice moves do not affect the corners. So if we were to add in wide R moves, we would preserve corner permutation, but we would break up edge orientation and the 2-3 block into only a first block. And this reduced state is called a CPFB. And we have now essentially derived what's called the CUR method, which relies on a reduction from generic scramble into one solvable with RU and wide R turns, and then further reduce this into a state solvable with only RU moves. We can also, if you find this a bit hard, add in wide U moves as a intermediate variant of solving our CPFB, and this is called a CP line, which is followed by extension in order to reach our CPFB. But there are more methods than CUR that can make use of this technique. So as we can see here with our first block, we can use something like RU. So because the corners are permuted already, we can actually solve we can insert our last slot together while solving CMLL using winter variation. There is also CP Nautilus, in which after the CPFB you solve a 2x2x2 block. Then you use RU and WIDAR moves to solve EO and DF, followed by last slot, and you finish the last layer with 2GLL. An important part here is that doing this corner permutation does not only improve ergonomics, but it also reduces the number of states. So that's why we are able to avoid something like CBLL, and instead can use only 2GLL. So to summarize, the cons here is that the CPFB requires 2 to 3 more moves than FB. However, this is the current human estimate, where one would use primarily CP line and extension to build CPFB rather than a more advanced singular step, which could bring the gap down further. The inspection is always going to be harder. It's going to be harder to plan deeper into the solve past our first block. But the pros here is that this leads to better ergonomics and TPS, and it reduces the number of states, leading to better look ahead and recognition, and big ALK sets become smaller, meaning that one can save moves and more than compensate the extra moves required for the CPFB.